it, and yes, thank you for letting me know that. Apparently Zoom got sued at some point. So now whenever you record something, it flashes up on everybody's screen and says recording is in progress, because I'm sure somebody, did something online they didn't mean to, and they're like, well, I didn't know it was recorded, and you're a very profitable company, so I'm sure I could get some money out of this. So anyway, so Ruth, you're going to need you to be on your best behavior because we are recording this. So just so you know. She's nodding yes, but I'm not sure I buy it. So we'll see how it goes. Okay, so we're going to get started jumping into the first of a couple of deep dives that we're going to do on the book of Ezekiel. And I thought it would be good just to start out with a question to try to figure out, like, how familiar are you with the book of Ezekiel? So let's say I want everybody to kind of rate themselves on a scale from 1 to 10. 1 would be like, the only time I've ever read Ezekiel is when you put some of the verses from it up on the screen on Sunday morning. And 10 would be like, I got my PhD in the textual history of the book of Ezekiel or something like that. So where, in terms of your familiarity with the book, where would you put yourself in there? Ron, come on in. So we got some 2s. Poor Rod, the chairman of our elder boards admitting, I never even read this book until he made me read a couple of verses of it on the screen on Sunday morning. So that's right. He was very busy delivering babies for many years. Oh, speaking of which, Taylor Lind, our youth minister, and his wife Misha, they had their baby yesterday. So yes, Jovi, Jovie, I believe. I don't know. Do you know the middle name? Ruth. Okay, Jovi Ruth Lind. So yeah, about 7:15 yesterday morning. So
on Sunday when he was up there,
then
he left. I was gonna go. So
yeah.
Did we have a baby yet?
Well, he doesn't. But the poor guy. I mean, you guys, a lot of you remember from having kids. Like for the last week and a half, it's been like any day now. So he's like, I don't know if I should. Like, should I schedule a lunch meeting with this person or not? Because maybe I'll be here, maybe I'll have to get. So I know they're overjoyed to have her here, but I'm sure on some level he's probably just like, oh, good, okay, at least I can, Well, I know, which is why you never had a chance to read the fascinating book of Ezekiel, except a little girl. Yep, so it's a little girl. So, so as a general rule, then, as far as the way the class goes, it seems like there's not a lot of deep familiarity with the book of Ezekiel, which is not a big surprise. I mean, that was my story. I'd never read the book of Ezekiel until I got to kind of right when I graduated from college. That summer, I decided, like, okay, I need to sit down. I need to just start reading through the whole Bible. I've never read through the whole Bible. I want to try to do that this year. So that was, I think it was the very first time, I mean, unless there'd been a random Sunday school lesson or sermon or something from it, that was the first time I'd ever read through it. And for me, it was one of those books that I felt like I had to get through it so that I could read the whole Bible off of my list. So it definitely wasn't something that I read it and was like, oh, this is just so enriching. I certainly didn't engage with it very deeply or understand it. A lot of it just kind of left me scratching my head. Then obviously I went on to seminary, and part of what we did in seminary was kind of an overview of all the different books of the Bible. So I had a little bit more familiarity with it because of that. But even then in seminary, if there were elective classes, like you'd have to take a certain number of hours on particular books of the Old Testament. Like, I never picked that one. So hey, come on in. I'm steering in a different direction. We go to the Psalms or some other kind of thing. Because again, it seemed really difficult to figure out, okay, how does this book connect with our life today? But anyway, all that to say, this summer I was able to audit a class up at Western Seminary that was just on the book of Ezekiel. Anyway, it was really helpful, especially because in the class they really tried to do what I've been trying to get at in the sermons, which is really like, okay, how do you go back to the original context? I think, okay, who was this guy and who's the people that he was talking to? And what on earth would it have been like for them to hear this message? And then more importantly, how would they have understood this message? What would it have communicated to them? And, when you do that, you go back to it, it really makes it come alive in ways that I had never really paid attention to before. and you realize just how much it has to say to us today. But I think what we need to do before we can jump into a discussion about the book of Ezekiel itself, we need to spend a little bit of time talking about the kind of writing that Ezekiel is. It's one of the books of the prophets, because it takes a little bit of orientation to get into the Old Testament prophets and kind of understand what they are. I mean, they're not the easiest books in the world to read and just to kind of click with and know what's going on. And has anybody ever felt that way reading the prophets before? Well, if you've ever felt that way, you are in very good company. So this is a quote from Martin Luther when he's talking about the prophets. He says, "The prophets have an odd way of talking, like people who, instead of proceeding in an orderly manner, just ramble off from one thing to the next so that you can't make head or tail of them or see what they're getting at." And that's kind of been my experience a lot of time reading the prophet. You're just like, wait, what is it? How does this relate to this? What's going on here? So what I want us to do, and Cass, you can do this with the folks who are online, and what I want you guys to do, since we have a couple more, let's break into two groups. And I want you to take just 4 or 5 minutes. And in your group, I want you to try to define the word prophecy. So if you had to define the prophecy, especially how it's used in the Bible, right? How would you define biblical prophecy? And then how is that different than the way prophecy maybe gets used in conversation today? Not that we have lots of conversations about that. But just take a couple of minutes and we're going to see if we can come up with a little bit of a working definition of what that is. So might need like 1 or 2 people. So I'd be curious to know, like both for your group online and just for you guys, how would you define prophecy, especially prophecy as that word is used in the Bible, and how that's different than how that word gets thrown out today?
From God,
Okay, from God, right?
relaying a message from God.
Yeah, it's kind of being God's messenger or God's spokesman, essentially. No, that's good. Cass, anything that you guys would add to that? Yep. Yeah, oftentimes it was. So you guys are ahead of the game. Rod, if you could help me, got a handout, and Cass can kind of share that with you online if you're wanting to do that. Yeah, Cass is going to send them to the people who are in the Zoom chat. I believe it's called like Reading the Old Testament Prophetic Books or something like that. Prophecy handout, maybe. Yeah, so basically the gist of what you guys said is really good, because most of the time, especially when people use the word prophecy today, like in conversation, they're thinking about like Nostradamus or, these sort of tabloid like, oh, we're going to predict what happens in the future. And when it comes to biblical prophecy like that there is a part of biblical prophecy that falls under that. It's kind of this prediction of future events. But it's really an inadequate definition, because it doesn't cover the huge amounts of the material in the prophetic books that are not looking forward to the future, making a prediction, that kind of thing. There are certain passages in the prophets that contain those, but most of it does not. I mean, really what prophecy is what you guys were saying. It's a message given directly by God to this prophet, who then serves as God's spokesman to convey that message to the hearers or the people who are reading. This prophet basically speaks. They're kind of like God's mouthpiece in that sense. And yes. We'll get to that just a second. Yep, we're working our way down. And as Cass, I think, mentioned, oftentimes we'll get into this. One of the themes that you often see in the prophetic writings is it's criticism. It's not always like, hey, here's an encouraging word from God for you today. It's sort of like, hey, this is the way you're supposed to be living, and here's how you're falling short. So there's often an element of that. So when you think about the Old Testament, there are different books that are known as the prophetic books. There's 15 of them, right? So you have 3 major prophets. You have Isaiah, Jeremiah, and Ezekiel, and they're just really called the major prophets because the books are long. It's really a function of that. And then there are the 12 minor prophets, that, all those kind of funny names that are there at the end of the Bible. And again, all of these books, they contain the messages that God gave the Israelite prophets. But it's not just, they're also the stories of the prophets are also set historically within the larger story of the people of Israel. So you guys, a lot of you may know that the order of the books in our Old Testament is different than the order of the books in the Hebrew New Testament. There's a lot of similarities, but there are some differences. And specifically in the Hebrew New Testament, you have a run of books that starts with Genesis and goes to what we know as Second Kings. And then from there, you start getting, that's where a lot of the other prophets come in. And that story between Genesis and Second Kings tells a sort of the history of the people of Israel from creation to the moment that they are carried off into exile in Babylon. So when you read through the Hebrew Bible, those are all told together in one continuous story. And then you have all the prophets. And those prophets usually have little notes in them that show you where they fit back in that story. Like in the 3rd year of King Uzziah, the word of the Lord came to so-and-so. So what those books do then, they help sort of place the specific timing, the specific words from God to the people of Israel at specific points in the story. So as readers, then you're supposed to be thinking about all of that. Okay, where does this fit in the overall story? What's going on in the life of the people of Israel? And then how does this message from God fit in with that? And really, if you look at that next part, I think that's one of the things that can make reading the prophets difficult, because it's not like a standalone book that you pick up and you can just read it on your own. They really assume that you have the whole story of the people of Israel kind of going in the background of your mind to understand, okay, where does this fit in? And specifically, this next section talks about background and context, the covenant story. It had a professor that referred to the prophets as covenant watchdogs, right? So they assume that the reader knows the history of God and the people of Israel and how that's been marked by different covenants. So then, as a reader, you understand where that specific message from God fits into that larger story, either of Israel's obedience to the covenant or disobedience to their part of the covenant. So the covenant story, I kind of highlighted it there for you in those parts. It begins with creation, with the idea that God is the creator and he's the ruler of a good world that has gone bad because of sin and human rebellion. So first thing in Genesis 12, he makes a covenant with Abraham. And he says, okay, Abraham, I'm going to use your family, the generations come from you, to restore my blessing to all of the nations. And then, a book later, he takes a subset of Abraham's family, right, the people of Israel. And after he brings them out of Egypt, he enters into another covenant with them, the Sinai covenant, or sometimes it's the Moses covenant. But that's where, it's where the people of Ezekiel are called to be a kingdom of priests, right? That's the call that's given to them in Exodus 19. And their part is to adhere to the laws of the covenant. And that's where, the rest of the book of Exodus and Numbers, a lot of those laws are spelled out there. And then the book of Deuteronomy ends with Moses reminding people like, hey, here are the blessings that come if you stick with the covenant, and here are the consequences if you don't. And then the story keeps going on. You have Joshua and you have Judges. And then by the time you start to get to the time of the Kings, you get to David, and then there's yet another covenant, right? God enters into a covenant with David, where he promises that one day someone from David's line will come and will rule as the Messiah and will bring blessing to all of the nations. And then wrapped up in that story of Israel, there are some hints and promises about a new covenant that's going to come. Because the story that you see over and over again through the history books is that the people of Israel they just utterly fail at keeping their side of the Sinai covenant. And because of that, that's the reason that they are ultimately sent into exile in Babylon. But you get some hints, especially in Jeremiah and Ezekiel, it's in Deuteronomy as well, but that one day, God knows that the people of Israel can't live up to their part of the deal. So he promises that one day there'll be this new covenant where he's going to literally transform their hearts so that they can truly love and obey their God and live out their side of this covenant. So all of that's kind of the big picture history of the people of Israel that all of the prophets assume that we've got in our back, that we've got going on kind of in the background of our minds, so that when we read their words, when we know where that fits in the story, we know how it fits into that. And then because of that, when you read through the books of the prophets, if you flip that handout over, there's a couple of themes that I think you see show up kind of over and over and over again. So one is this idea of accusations. Cass, I think, was bringing this up, that Israel and the nations, they have rebelled against their God. So Israel, the northern kingdom, or Judah, they've broken the covenant, they worshiped other gods, they made alliances with foreign nations when God repeatedly says, hey, trust me, I'm going to take care of you. You don't need to make an alliance with Egypt or with this other superpower. I will protect you. But the nations, the nation of Israel specifically has fallen down on that. So a lot of the accusations from the prophets are directed towards God's people for their failure to meet the part of the covenant. But then there are also some other times, like in the book of Ezekiel, he spends a lot of chapters talking about Egypt and talking about Assyria. So there's also this sort of prophetic accusations against the other nations, like not just the people of Israel, but the nations around them, Moab, Edom, all those kinds of things. And typically the accusations for them is that they're guilty of injustice, or they're cruel, or they're arrogant. In Ezekiel, it talks about sort of the king of Tyre and how he sort of raises himself up like he thinks he's made this all on his own. He's really called out for his arrogance and his cruelty. So that's a main theme in the prophets, this idea of accusations. There's also this almost continual call for repentance, right? God doesn't want his people to go down this other road. He wants his people to be faithful to him. So he's always calling them back. And a lot of times in the prophet, that is seen as a call to return to right worship, come back to the right practices, the right worship of God. And I think this kind of goes to what Cass was talking about. You also see that fairly often in this call from God to the people of Israel to take care of the vulnerable in their community, the widows, the orphans, the immigrants. God often says, you were slaves in Egypt. Remember that. You were once not a people. Now you're my people. Part of what it means to be this covenant people of God is that you love God and you love and care for the vulnerable around you. So this call to repentance is a call back to both of those things. He calls people back, stop worshiping, Tammuz and these other gods and come back and worship me, and do what you're supposed to do in caring for the people around you. So they're often accused of not doing that and invited to begin to live that way again. Another big theme in the prophets is warnings, right? There are warnings that the situation is not going to go unaddressed forever. Oftentimes the prophets talk about it as the day of the Lord. The day of the Lord is coming when injustice is going to be sort of settled once and for all. Rebellion will be dealt with. And in the words of the different prophets, there's that prophecy really points to a couple of different things. It points to specific events in history that have already happened, like the Babylonian exile. That was something that was done to punish and judge evil. But it also kind of points ahead as well to this moment when God is going to come back and fully and finally kind of put this broken world back together. So sometimes in prophecy, you see that it's one prophecy, but it's kind of pointing to two, or it can point to even multiple events where the same things happen. But yeah, it's just this idea that Yahweh is going to bring justice against human rebellion, and he's going to bring judgment on individual nations, especially nations like Assyria and Babylon and Egypt, who have been so prideful and have went against God's people and have left such destruction all around them. And then the last of the major themes I think that you see in the prophetic books is this announcement of restoration and hope, right? Like judgment is coming, but there's always hope in there as well. And that's even, we'll see when you look at the book of Ezekiel and the way it's structured, the first 32 chapters, Ezekiel is just letting the exiles know Jerusalem's going to be destroyed. It's going to be destroyed. It's going to be destroyed. It's going to be destroyed. Then in chapter 33, a refugee shows up and says, the city is fallen. And Ezekiel's like, okay. And then the last, 15 chapters are all this picture of hope. Like, the judgment that he promised is coming, but hope is the last word in the book. So there's hope for this kind of righteous remnant that will remain faithful. There's hope for a restoration from exile. You're not going to be there forever. And there's hope that this new covenant is someday going to come, right? Where we'll be given a new heart and a new spirit. And then hope that even one day God is going to come and set up his kingdom where everything, including all of creation, will be restored. That's something the last chapter or so of Ezekiel kind of paints a picture of that, of all creation being restored. So I wanted to give you all of that Just because, Ezekiel, that like the prophetic writings, like they're very unique. It's not like you're reading a history book where it's just like, oh, okay, well, then Ezekiel did this, then he did this, then he did this, then the city fell, and then this happened. There's all these other things going on. So when you read through the book and you keep in mind what it is, and you keep in mind kind of the themes that often show up in that, it can give you a handle to begin to sort of wrap your brain around some of what's going on, because you start, as you read through the book, you start to see accusations and calls for repentance and warnings about things. You see those things come up over and over again, and you see how they fit in that larger story of what God is doing. You have questions about that, or comments, or anything that you want to talk about? Yeah. So Rod, and I'll repeat it so the people on Zoom can hear it.
People who would have read what Ezekiel wrote, did they understand what he was saying? Was his style of writing contemporary for those guys? It's just odd for us, or was it mysterious for the reader while Ezekiel was still alive? That's what I'm wondering. Similar thing, like, was it interpreted?
Well, so there's different, even like we saw this past Sunday in the sermon, like some of what Ezekiel says, he just says it, right? Here's a message from the Lord, da, da, da. And some of it he's kind of acting out, and the people have to figure out what that means. My assumption to answer that question is that people would have understood the message, because again, like without like, it's this mysterious esoteric thing that you need somebody else to come along and interpret. Like, for example, when you get into the chapters where Ezekiel is talking about the king of Tyre, for example, and well, you've done this and you've done this, and for us, like, that's literally ancient history, and not an ancient history that many of us study in depth. But for them, like, that's what's going on in the country next door. Like, they grew up knowing what was going on in Tyre. So I think those images, like, I think it would have made more sense to them. They would have understood what was going on.
So maybe there was a richness in Ezekiel, even some elements of Ezekiel himself. He was a faithful conduit for God's message that he himself may not have fully understood what he was writing, and the readers, because there's so much prophecy that is way into the future, too, or it has three different meanings, or addresses three different events.
Sure. And so I think when you're talking about prophecies like that, like sometimes when you look at some of the things that Jesus said near the end of his life, and he's talking about the end. There's a passage in Matthew where he's talking about destruction that's coming, and it seems like he's predicting the destruction of the temple in AD 70 that happened within. But then a little bit late, just a couple of verses later, you're like, okay, I think he's talking kind of beyond that now. I had a professor once who tried to describe that kind of prophecy. It's like a mountain range where you see multiple peaks in a row. And like, you're kind of talking about one, but you're also kind of talking about the ones behind them. As far as that goes, like for Ezekiel, I don't know. I don't know if he thinks like, I'm talking about the fall of Babylon, but God through his providence is going to show how what I'm saying here applies to other situations too. Yeah, I don't know about that. But I do think that that everything that's in the book of Ezekiel would have made sense to the original audience of Ezekiel in a way that it's more challenging for us to get to because of the time and the distance.
Seems a little less challenging when we actually apply it to where we are right now, our world.
Yeah.
All of these same things.
Yeah.
Are happening. Rebellion and the need for repentance, all of them.
Yeah, no, I mean, we're in again, the prophets assume the background of God's history of covenants with the people of Israel. So the words of the prophets still speak to us and apply to us today, but we're at a different place historically than they were.
Right.
It's kind of like when people use that, like there's that verse in either First and Second Chronicles, like if my people will call on my name and pray, then I'll turn and I will heal them. It's a beautiful verse. It's God did not have the United States in mind when he wrote it, because it's written to the people of Israel. If anything, that verse applies to the Church of Jesus Christ today, not necessarily to the nation that we live in. So it can be a little bit, because we're in a different place historically, it's not always a one-to-one comparison, if that makes sense. But a lot of these same themes, are God's people being faithful is God going to restore what is lost and broken? Is there judgment coming to people who ignore God? But is there always hope on the side of, yeah, a lot of those things are still very true, no matter where you are.
So does the new covenant start at Pentecost?
That's a good question.
Also, the book of Revelation is in the New Testament, but it sure seems like a prophetic book.
Oh, it is a prophetic book in a lot of ways.
Future telling.
Yeah. Although a lot of that too was really describing the world of the Roman Empire that they
Yeah.
were living in. But it's interesting, right? This is a total side note. Revelation is one of the books of the New Testament that directly quotes from the Old Testament. No, not a lot, but almost every verse alludes to something or refers to something. It's almost like the author of the book of Revelation, like their brain was so saturated in the story of the Old Testament that when they write, just references that are just naturally what come out. Like there's like almost everything in there is connected back to something, but very rarely does he say, it's not like in Matthew where he says, like the prophet said, Rachel is weeping. That's a direct quote. So you had your hand up.
Is there future stuff for us in there? Is Jesus?
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. Yeah, there are some passages, especially when you kind of get into the hope section of the book. So there's some passages where it talks about how God's going to give his people a new spirit and a new heart. It talks about how he's going to give them a new shepherd. And he uses language that it really seems like Jesus has that language in mind in John 10 when he's describing himself. So he's kind of like, hey, you guys remember those stories you heard growing up about Ezekiel and he promised a new shepherd? Well, I'm the good shepherd. I am I think he had some of those things in mind for sure. So yeah, Cass.
I'll just unmute so they can hear me. As reading through this and preparing for this every week, it's one of those books that I find pretty impossible to read without my commentary. Like I just pulled up in chapter 17, the 2 eagles and a vine, and I read this and I just remember going, what? And immediately dropping down to the commentary and please give me some sort of insight into what this is talking about. And I mean, and with it pulling the different cultural things that they would have known, and the eagle represented Babylon, and all of this stuff that I'm just like, just right over my head. I have no idea that. I mean, I'm so thankful to have those tools to try and make sense of this. But you have to assume that the people would have known more. I mean, of what that's talking about. And then other things are much easier, like the chapter before, the allegory of unfaithful Jerusalem and being prepared, and its comparisons to like an unfaithful wife and stuff. Like you can get what he's getting at with that. You don't need the commentary to understand what he's getting at with that sort of a thing. But yeah, it's been an interesting read, that's for sure.
Yeah, my dad recently gave me a study Bible that he had. It's really nice, real thick, and he's like, yeah, the print's too small, I can't see it. I've put my reading glasses on to read it, so I mean I'm going down that road too. But like you read like the book of Joshua, and it's like mostly text with some little footnotes at the bottom. You read Ezekiel, and it's like a little bit of text, a lot of footnotes at the bottom to try to explain it. Yeah, it's definitely like that.
So when you first read through it at the end of college, did you use a commentary or did you just read through?
No, I was just like, I got 3 chapters to get through today, like, and it's one of those things you're just like, Lord, if I get some nugget out of this that hopefully is helpful some way, somewhere, somehow, that'd be great. But if not, I'm going to read a chapter of Proverbs every day too, because I know something in there is going to be helpful. No, they're just really interesting books. So let's do this. So with that in mind, that's kind of the sort of biblical prophecy as a whole, as a genre, as a category. So with that in mind, now what I want us to do is look a little bit at the overall structure of the book of Ezekiel, and then some of the major themes that show up in there's going to be some overlap with those prophetic themes. And again, Ezekiel is one of those books that like it's it's not easy to figure out what the structure of the book is. So there's another quote that I wanted to share with you. This comes from, it's a commentary on a different prophet, on Jeremiah, by a guy named John Bright. And he says, what makes the prophetic books particularly, and one might say needlessly difficult, is the very manner of their arrangement, or to be more accurate, their apparent lack of arrangement. All seems confusion. The impression that the reader gains is one of extreme disarray. One can scarcely blame him for concluding that he's reading a hopeless hodgepodge thrown together without any discernible principle of arrangement at all. And it is true. I mean, sometimes you read through it and like there's a chapter talking about, the failures of the leaders, and then all of a sudden you're off here and he's talking about, well, the Moabites are doing this, and then you go back and then Ezekiel's chopping all of his hair off, and then you just kind of wonder, like, did a kindergartner, like did he write it all out and then the wind blew and the pages all flew apart and somebody just grabbed it and stuck it and said, close enough, something like that. I kind of wonder. Sometimes I came across that quote and I'm like, that feels pretty accurate. So let me give you another couple of handouts. That's probably going to be enough. Because this is that Ezekiel structure and main themes.
Just share that.
If you could pass that out too. So a couple of different handouts that I'm giving you. One is a little bit about the way the book is structured and some of its main themes. And then the other one is the poster for the Bible Project video on Ezekiel. The Bible Project puts together videos that are sort of overviews to each book. And they're really they sort of draw these posters as they go. The Ezekiel one's actually two different videos. It's like they looked at this and they're like, there's so much stuff going on here. We got to split it up in two videos. And again, this is one of those things that I'm like, I can't get paper big enough in the printer to print it up where I can actually see it without my glasses anymore. So when you really get down to, okay, so what is the book of Ezekiel? It's really the collected visions and the collected prophecies of this 30-year-old priest, right, who was living in exile in Babylon. He was a priest. He was taken captive in the first wave of the Babylonian attack and exiled in 598 BC. That story is told in 2 Kings 24. He's a contemporary of Jeremiah. So if you ever read through like the book of Jeremiah, they're prophesying at roughly the same time. They're just about 1,000 miles apart. Jeremiah is still in the city of Jerusalem until he gets sort of kidnapped to Egypt near the end. And Ezekiel is in Babylon, but they're addressing the same historical moment from slightly different locations. And there's a lot of different ways to think about how to structure this book. So for example, if you just look at this structure and theme, most people agree sort of that chapter 33 is really a dividing point in the book. Because in chapter 1, you get this call, Ezekiel is called to be a prophet. And he's supposed to give this message to the exiles about why it is that they're in exile. It's because of previous generations and their own unfaithfulness to God. And then part of the message that goes on from that is that Jerusalem, even though, the way the history works, the Babylonians captured the city of Jerusalem, took some people off into exile, but they left the city running for a while with the idea that it was going to be sort of, paying tribute to them and all of that. After about 8 or 10 years of that, the city rebels again. And the second time the Babylonians come back, they're not putting up with that anymore. So they destroy that's when the temple is destroyed. After they lay siege to the city and they break through the walls, they kill almost all of the people who are there. They just burn the city to the ground. So Ezekiel is, the first part of the book takes place between the first time the Babylonians take the city and the second time. So they capture the city, he's called off into exile. His message to the people is an explanation of why they're in exile. But he's also saying, by the way, like judgment is coming to the city of Jerusalem. And that's still happening. And then in Ezekiel 8 through 11, God appears to him again in a vision, and he sort of like spiritually teleports him back to Jerusalem and takes him on a tour of the city and lets him see what's going on in the city of Jerusalem right now. And that's where you see like people in the temple worshiping other gods, and the people are being unfaithful to God. So that it's a picture for Ezekiel of this is what's going on in the city right now. This is why judgment will again come to it. So the first 11 chapters of the book kind of sets that background. And then chapters 12 through 24 are Ezekiel's messages to the people of Israel, both the ones who are there in exile and sort of talking about what's going to be happening to Judah and Jerusalem. And then for chapters 25 to 32, he starts talking about how God's judgment is going to come again on the other nations that surround them. You know, Ammon, Moab, Edom. It kind of spirals out geographically from there. And he spends a lot of time focusing on Tyre and Sidon, who are a neighbor, and then Egypt, which is another one of the kind of superpowers of the day. So that first 32 chapters is really about judgment, explaining why the judgment of the exile has happened, talking about the judgment that's going to come onto the city, and then talking more about the judgment that's going to come on these surrounding nations. And then in Ezekiel 33, there's a moment when historically where Jerusalem has fallen again, and they kill most of the people who are there, but a few of them that are left, they haul off back into exile in Babylon. And the picture in Ezekiel 33 is of the first of those people coming in. And there are these other exiles who've been in exile for 10 years, and they've been hoping Jerusalem's okay, but they've been hearing it's going to be judged. And then you picture that scene, that first wave of the people who somehow survived the sack of the city, show up and say, Jerusalem's gone, right? And it's at that moment that the book turns. Up until that point, Ezekiel has been saying, this is the judgment that's going to come, it's going to come, it's going to come. Then once it comes, his message completely shifts to God is not done with us, right? There is hope, there is restoration that's going to be coming. And then that's when he starts talking about, the hope for a future messianic king. And it's that chapter that has that language about the shepherd, and that I think Jesus is really drawing on in John 10. In chapters 35 and 36 is when he talks about that new covenant, where he talks about, I'm gonna write my spirit, I'll put my spirit in them so that they can obey from the heart. Chapter 37, if you know the story in Ezekiel, the vision that he has of the valley of the dry bones, God kind of takes them out, and there's just all these bones everywhere, and then they sort of come back to life, and the sinews get put, it's like they get created in reverse. It's a kind of a lot of interesting parallels to Genesis and creation account and what God is doing in recreating the people, his people there. Then there's a little break, 38 and 39, where you see how there's really hope, not just for the people of Israel to be restored, but there's hope for all of the other nations, because the kind of the prototypical bad guys, right, of Gog and Magog, they're going to be destroyed once and for all. And then that hope spins out, and it's really becomes hope for the entire creation is going to be restored, because there's like this 8 or 9 chapter stretch where Ezekiel has this vision where he's shown this new city and this new temple, and they spend way too much time talking about the dimensions of the new temple and the blueprint of the temple and the rooms in the temple. And it's like, that's like when I was reading through that to get through the book, I had like 4 chapters left, and I was like, I'm not gonna make it. Oh. But then there's this beautiful scene at the end of that where he talks about the temple, and he talks about this little trickle of water that comes out from the altar, and then it becomes a little brook and then a stream and a river. And he walks along, and like every 1,000 meters or so he measures it, and it's up to his shins, and then his knees, and then it's up to his waist, and it's so deep he can't cross it. And then that river goes out into the Dead Sea Valley and brings life wherever it goes, right? And it becomes this incredible fertile place. And there's this picture of hope, not just for God's people, but for God's created world, right? All of this is going to be restored one day. So one way to look at the book and how it's structured is how chapter 33 is sort of this pivot point between judgment and then grace and hope. And if you think about it, I mean, in that sense, Ezekiel it's a pretty good description of the gospel, right? There's the problem of sin and the judgment we're under, and then there's the hope that comes because of the grace that we have in God. Another way to think about how this book is structured is by looking at the way that it talks about the glorious presence of God. So we talked about this a little bit in the first sermon, right? So the first sermon in the series, Ezekiel is sitting on the banks of this irrigation canal in Babylon. And he's a priest, so he knows that God's physical presence is supposed to be in the temple. But then he has this amazing vision, with the living creatures, with the 4 faces and all this stuff, and he looks and he realizes, oh my goodness, like God's here. Like he's physically present here. He's not supposed to be here, but he's here with his people. And then one of the things that it kind of begs the question, like, well, what's going on in Jerusalem? Like, why isn't his presence there where he promised it? So in chapters 8 through 11, that's when he has this God gives him this vision, and he goes back to see all the sin that's happening in Jerusalem, the idolatry. And as part of that vision, he sees the presence of God leave the temple and head east. So it's almost like he's got a picture of what happened. So his glory, God's glory shows up in the first chapter. In chapters 8 through 11, you get this picture of the glory of God leaving. And then right in the middle of that last chunk of chapters 40 through 48, where he's got this vision of the future, and there's a new city and a new temple, there's this moment in there where you see God's presence come back in to the temple, right? So you can split the book up and kind of divide it just by looking at how God's presence like sort of physically moves. Like, why is he not with his people? What would the reason for that be? Why would he not be with them anymore? And then why is he back? So that's another way to think about kind of the movement of the book. So if you want to flip that over now, and then the back page of this, just some things that are kind of main themes of the book of Ezekiel. As you can see, I got this outline and some of the themes from a handout from the class that I audited this summer. So one of the themes is that Israel has just completely abandoned their God. They have been rebellious since the exit, since that Sinai covenant in Exodus 19. If you remember that story, right? God makes the covenant with them. Moses goes up the mountain to get to the 10 Commandments. And before he even comes back down, the first thing they do is make the golden calf, right? They're falling down on their part of the covenant from the very beginning. That idolatry is connected with social injustice. Ezekiel talks about that in chapter 22. And they've literally filled the city of Jerusalem with idols, even in the temple. That's the picture that he sees in Ezekiel 8. It's a weird and interesting passage. It's like he's got these Holy Spirit goggles on or something to let him see what's going on. At one point, he sort of digs through the wall of the temple, and he gets a picture into this inside room where the people are worshiping like scarab beetles, which again were this sort of divine presence in Egypt, right? And at that time, people in Jerusalem, they're wanting to make a political alliance with Egypt because maybe they can help them against the Babylonians. So there's just all sorts of fascinating stuff. So Israel has completely abandoned God. Therefore, God has abandoned his temple, right? That's the picture that you get in Ezekiel 10 is God's glory leaves because of what people have done. And then the other thing, his decision to bring judgment on them, it is irreversible at this point. And yeah, I always think about like the Pope Mobile, that he drives around in. Yeah, exactly. So, and yeah, it's interesting in chapter 14, Ezekiel, it's almost like he's like, well, what if, I'm trying to remember who they are. I think it's Abraham and, no, it's Noah. There you go, Noah, Daniel, and Job. Even if Noah and Daniel and Job were to come and sort of advocate, like testify on behalf of the people who do that, it's too late. Even those righteous guys can't stem the tide. And Ezekiel emphasizes over and over again that the judgment is because of this generation's sin. So not this Sunday, but next Sunday, the sermon is about Ezekiel chapter 18, where it talks about there. In that chapter, the people who are in exile are grumbling because they're like, well, it's not us, it's our parents who sinned, and now we're being punished for that. And Ezekiel's like, no, that's not how it works. God doesn't punish people for the sins of their parents. He punishes each generation for what they've done. So that's a message he does over and over. Again, the judgment's going to affect the surrounding nations as well. But after the exile, God is going to restore Israel. And not just that, he will enable them to actually keep the covenant, right? You get those passages where it talks about, I'll put a new heart in you. I'll put my spirit in you. There's parallel language in the book of Jeremiah, for example. And again, Jeremiah and Ezekiel, they're sharing similar messages at a similar time. Jeremiah also has passages where it talks about, it's like, I'll write my law upon their heart, and I'll put my spirit in them so they can obey me for the inside out. And what I would encourage you to do with this, if you read through the book of Ezekiel, like just keep a document like this with you. Hey, here are the main themes. And then as you read through a chapter, especially if it's a chapter where you're like, what is going on here? It can help them, okay, is it somehow tied into one of these themes? Does that give me a window into understanding it, even if it's framed up with references to cultural things I don't get, or historical people that I don't know who they are? This kind of thing can help you kind of get some guidance in that. comments about that? Thoughts, questions? Yes, Rod.
So how long did it take for one book of Ezekiel to come out?
Well,
We think in terms of a really famous or wealthy writer writing for a year or part of a year. But I guess, was it written over many years?
it records events that span like somewhere between 15 and 25 years, I think, from the beginning of the exile. Yeah, because there are certain markers in there where he says, in the 5th year of this king's reign, this happened. And I can't remember when it is, but there's towards the end when he's getting around chapter 40, and he talks about this last vision. There's something in there that kind of, in the 27th reign of such and such. So you can look at that and you can say, okay, this didn't all happen at once.
But some of it is written in real time, and then some of it is written in future time.
Yeah, and then
At the same time.
and then at some point, fairly soon after, again, because it seems like it's pretty contemporaneous, somebody had to take all these different things that were written down and collect them and put them into the text that we have today. And that's why, like, if you go back to Ezekiel chapter 1, most of Ezekiel is in the first person. It's Ezekiel. I got this message from God. He said, except for a verse in chapter 1 where he says, on the 5th month, I was sitting here, and then it's like, this happened in this, and Ezekiel was 30 years old. So there's like a little note from probably whoever was inspired by God to pull these things together into their final form. It's like, all right, God's leading me. I'm going to put just little cliff notes here to help people understand where they are in the story and put it together. And this is a different topic for a different day, but sort of the history of how these books came together is really interesting. Because like if you look at the book of Jeremiah, so in Jeremiah, where is it? I may even have that on here somewhere. If it's in the 30s, maybe 35, 36, it talks about how Jeremiah basically spoke the prophecies, and a guy named Baruch wrote them all down. So he's penning it all down, and they take it to the king. And the king he's reading it, and just one at a time, he's just cutting it up and he's throwing it into the fire. So then Jeremiah and Baruch go back and they redo it. And they kind of, it's like an new and expanded edition where they add some things to it. So there's, I think some of these things were like, God gave me the message and I wrote it down and here it is in its final form. And I think other things are, God wrote it, and then, I really feel like God is leading me to frame it up this way, or to add this story here because of how it comes together. And, if you believe that the Bible is the inspired word of God working through people, like he can work through people over time as well to bring it into these forms. I don't know if that was the question you were asking or not, or if I just went down a rabbit trail. Yeah. Typically, I honestly don't know. I tend to think of like, and some of this is language that I just got from a handout from class. So, but I tend to think of the oracles are almost like these, like a pronouncement against another nation. Like here, like almost like a declaration kind of thing. But I don't know if there's a nuance between those words or not, or if they can be used interchangeably. That's a good question. Other questions?
So when we look at this book of Ezekiel, and especially all the talking about the people did this, they rebelled, are we in a sense to say people really haven't changed at all? And that could be us, that could be me.
Mm-hmm.
Is that what, when you're doing this sermon series, is that part of what's in the back of your mind?
Yeah.
Because it doesn't seem like they're doing anything original. If you look, well, what's happening today?
Yeah. Yeah. Well, and it is funny, right? Because, like we look back at sort of the ancient Near East and we're like, oh, this primitive pagan people with their statues, to these gods, and they're made out of wood. And like, we know that's not real and da, da, da. But,
It's not.
we put our trust in money and sex and military and power, all sorts of things today. Yeah, exactly. Yeah, I mean, people, probably the fundamental nature of the human heart hadn't changed much. It just the trappings and the dressings and how things get expressed is what changes. Tim Keller, who I think he's kind of retired from ministry now, or church ministry, but he was a pastor for a number of years in the New York City area. He's got a book called Counterfeit Gods. And it's basically a book about idolatry. But he's just kind of saying, we don't have, it's not like our neighbors have, like an 18-inch statue of like Marduk or something in their home that they're worshiping. But we've got other things that we put our trust and allegiance in, just in the same way that they put them in those gods made out of stone and wood. The impulse of the human heart is very much the same. The thing that we direct it to looks a little bit more sophisticated, but it's probably not all that different when you get right down to it. That's a chipper thought, right? It's 2,000 years on this side of the cross and we're still as messed up as they were back then. Yeah, well, also a biblical idea. So here's what I want you to do then. We're going to get back in groups for a couple minutes. And what I want you to do is I want you to read Ezekiel chapter 15. It's short. It's only like maybe 8 or 10 verses. But as you're reading that, I want you to read it kind of with these main themes in mind, and kind of think about where it is in the structure of the book, and think about where it is in the history of the people of Israel, kind of all those things together. And then what you can do is in your group is really, what I would say is just have one person read that passage out loud. It should just take a minute or two. It's not super long. And then just think, okay, how does understanding the overall structure of the book, the overall themes of the book, and the whole story of the Old Testament, how does it help you make sense of this individual passage, which on its surface is like about a dried up vine that's burnt up? So does that sound like a plan? Yeah, I'll probably give you about 10 minutes to do that. Yeah, that is often the experience that I have in reading, is that you just, wait, is it, no, oh wait, maybe we're here again. Did it help to kind of have the themes in front of you? Like which of those, when you look at those, were there things that jumped out at you? Like, oh yeah, I see that theme at play here in this. It was too much? It was on the back of the sheet.
Well, it seems like your main themes 1 through 5 all belong to that.
Mm-hmm.
Israel is completely abandoned Yahweh. They really weren't working toward the city of Jerusalem when it smashed up the first time. God had sort of abandoned his temple. Judgment that was going to burn them up like other kinds of tree branches.
Mm-hmm.
And it's for that this generation of some other generation. Maybe 1 through 4.
Yeah, and not obviously not every theme shows up in every chapter or in every passage. But again, if you do the work of understanding, okay, where in the broad story of the history of Israel is this happening? Okay, some of the people are in exile, some are still in Jerusalem. That kind of gets you in the right neighborhood. And then, okay, what part of the book is this in? Well, we haven't gotten to the hope part yet. It's laying it's almost trying to show the people the reason that they need God and they need hope. So they're trying to highlight that. And then, you get into the chapter itself and you see some of these things specifically kind of calling out the people of Judah and the city of Jerusalem for their sin. And again, I'm sure there's probably stuff in here about, maybe the vine means something that we don't know that it means, or was that symbolic of something? There's always more that you can dig into. And then there's chapters, where it's like Cass was saying, there's 2 eagles, or they're doing this, and then the vine shows up again, and you're like, what does it do with the vine?
Red Bibles don't have a
Yeah. I know.
So let's go with this. I can hear some of the things you're saying, like what did here just said. But I think the part where it talks about the vine is burned and the people will also still be burned.
Mm-hmm.
And it's irreversible.
Mm-hmm.
We just like that on here.
Yeah. Mm-hmm. And again, and that's why it's helpful to look at the passage in and of itself because of what it's saying, but then to realize, okay, the way it comes to us is part, that message at one point, Ezekiel says that to a group of people who are physically there in plains outside of Babylon, and they hear it at this one moment. But the way that God in his wisdom has given it to us is it's part of this book as a whole. So we can read that. And then this idea that, it's burned up beyond repair, but then we also can skip ahead 22 chapters to where there's this valley that's just covered up with bones and it looks like there could be no life at all. But then, God brings new life to that. Or you read about, this vine that's been cut off and there's no hope. And you jump over to Isaiah and you talk about how this, out of this stump, the shoot of Jesse will come up and there's this promise of hope. Yeah, absolutely. Right. And again, and that's where it's interesting living 2,000 years on this side of the cross, because the book of Ezekiel spoke into this particular moment in the history of the people of Israel, but God's work in the world didn't stop around 600 BC. Like, he's still going. So for us, we read this passage and you're like, oh, this vine, it's not worth anything. It's all burned up. But then you think, okay, well, if you jump to John 15, Jesus says, I'm the vine and you are the branches. And maybe he's got something like this in mind, and maybe he doesn't, but it's clear that these ideas continue to be developed and they grow as you move throughout kind of the ongoing story of God's work among his people in the world.
I got a impression of, Jesus says that, yeah, he's fine, but this talks about wood,
Mhm.
also. And then, I don't say,
She brought a Bible with notes.
She does this in Sunday school class all the time.
Cheating. Mhm.
God reminds the exiles of this church of Israel, it's not because many it's always
Yeah, sure. That could very much be part of it. Yeah, it's not like.
Nothing.
Mhm.
I read my life.
She's got the Bible. There you go. And you brought your reading glasses too, so you can read the notes. That's good thinking. So the last thing that I wanted to point out to you tonight, if you can, go back to the first chapter of Ezekiel if you've got a Bible with you, because there's that passage where in this vision, God appears to the vision, and he's on this sort of mobile God chariot, right? This God mobile thing that's being carried by these living creatures. Yeah, and just listen to sort of how these creatures are described, starting in verse 5. It says, "In the fire was what looked like 4 living creatures. In appearance, their form was human, but each of them had 4 faces and 4 wings. Their legs were straight, their feet were like those of a calf and gleamed like burnished bronze. Under their wings, on their 4 sides, they had human hands," right? So there's faces and wings and hands, and then the faces look like this. The face of a human being, and the face of a lion, and the face of an ox, and the face of an eagle. And you look at this and you just think, like, this is just the most bizarre thing that you can possibly imagine. It's almost like a horror movie, this thing with all these faces and what's going on here. But again, what we have to remember is, again, this kind of goes back to Rod's question, like, do you think this made sense to Ezekiel? And I think something like this made much more immediate sense to him than it does to us. Like, we have to remember that whenever you find something in the Bible that is weird, like, that is an invitation for you to dig deeper. Because if it's something that's weird to you, like, God is not random, right? So if there's something that seems strange to you, it probably means, oh, there's something I don't know about. There's more to the story here that I'm not aware of. So what seems strange to us was really familiar and symbolic to Ezekiel and his contemporaries. So these animals that they're described individually or in combination, these 4 creatures are found in religious art and religious statues all across the ancient Near East, right? So let me just sort of show you a couple of things here. So this is a statue of 2 lions supporting a Syrian deity. So just like in Ezekiel 1, there's that platform, and there are these creatures that are kind of holding the platform up. God is sitting on top of that. Like, this is from about 1000 BC near Carchemish, which is actually where the Babylonians destroyed the Egyptian army. But it's just sort of this picture of, like, okay, this idea that there could be like almost like a throne chariot, or this sort of mobile throne where these creatures carry the God around. Like, that's something that people got. That was sort of part of their. They would see that in statues where they would go to town and things like that. Next one. So this is from Assyria. I guess this is Lamassu. But if you look at him, right, he's part human, right? He's got the head of the king. He's got wings, so he's part bird, but his body is a bull. right? So it's this combination of these different animals, just like you see in that vision. Same thing here. So this is a picture from the Persian view. So this is right around the time. This is within about 60 years of when Ezekiel's written. So you've got the God who's kind of up on that platform, and that platform is being carried by these things who have wings and human hands that are part human and part bull. That same kind of thing here. This is much older, but this is a deity who's got 4 faces. And the deal with the 4 faces, right, is they see everything. Because it's like when your mama used to say, like, I got eyes in the back of my head. He's got eyes in the back and the sides too, right? So this deity is going to see everything and know everything. And then this is actually something that came from Israel near the city of Megiddo. And again, it's this combination creature. It's a bird and a lion. And when you stop and think about it, okay, these hybrid creatures, they're sort of, they kind of represent this blending of different realms. You've got creatures of the land and creatures from the air that are together. Just like, heaven meets earth, right? The sky and the earth come together. You have these sort of mythical created animals that sort of bridge those 2 worlds. And it's interesting because the imagery that God uses to communicate to Ezekiel is something that it would have meant something to him, because the Babylonians used something similar. And that's not saying that the Babylonians got it right. I think it is saying that God speaks to us in a language that we understand. And it's interesting, right? So in Ezekiel's vision, these animals, they kind of function as throne bearers. And the fact that there are 4 of them with these 4 faces, right? It represents the 4 cardinal directions of the compass, right? It means that the whole world is kind of under his control. It shows up in phrases like coming from the 4 winds that gets used in Ezekiel in different places. And it's interesting, right? Think about what those different creatures represented. So Christopher Wright wrote a commentary on it, and I just want to read it to you. He says this. So the lion, right, one of those 4 faces, the lion was renowned for its strength and courage and ferocity. It served as a symbol of royalty. The eagle was the swiftest and most stately of the birds. The ox was not only a valuable domestic animal, but it functioned as a symbol of divinity and fertility and strength. And the human, right, it has a human face as well, was created in the image of God and invested with this divine majesty. It's the most dignified and noble of all of the creatures that God created. But he says the significance of these creatures exceeds the sum of the parts, right? Carrying the divine throne, this 4-headed living being, declares that the God who it's holding up has the strength and the majesty of the lion, the swiftness and the mobility of the eagle, the power of the bull and the strength of the bull, and the wisdom that is given to humankind. And again, it's just one of those things for us. We think like, well, that's just so weird. But it's almost like when God is communicating to Ezekiel, he's like, how the Babylonians, they think that this eagle is, represents this. And maybe this God's got a little bit of bull, because he's strong. He's like, I got all of them, right? All of the creatures are ultimately mine because I'm the one God who made this world and really does. They all do my bidding. They're carrying my throne around. So you think about what that would have communicated to him and to the audience who's hearing that. It's, God's speaking their language. And he's taking these little things that they thought was true about gods, lowercase g gods, and saying, if you thought that was true for Marduk, you need to understand that it is exponentially more true for me because I am the one true God who created this world. And I think that kind of stuff is interesting. It's one of those things you read that story and you're like, I got no idea what those people were thinking. It seems it was like the day before that God rescued them out of Egypt. But yeah, I'm guessing it would be something like that. Because again, when they put the calf together, what they say is, this is the God who brought us out of Egypt, right? It's a reference to the strength and the delivering power. So maybe, yeah, I never thought about it, but maybe that is why they went for a calf there. Sure. That could very well be. Yeah. And again, I think that part of what their Ezekiel is getting at here, what God is getting at here in choosing to communicate this way, is that there there are little sparks of truth in all of these other religions, in the sense that they know there's something out there. Like I remember there have been times when, like, so think about like the first really sunny day in April in Oregon after a long winter. You walk out and the sun hits you and you think, okay, I get why people used to worship this. I mean, really, because it's just the power and the warmth, and you're like that is amazing, and it comes back every single day, you know, and the crops grow because of it.
The moon,
Yeah,
wonderful.
yeah. No, but I mean, you see how, you know, in Ecclesiastes it talks about how God has written eternity on the human heart, or Romans 1 talks about how, you know, people they're without excuse because you just look at the world and at least be able to puzzle some pieces of it together. And I think when you look at passages like this, it's almost like a recognition that these other approaches to the divine, like they're off base, but they manage to catch a little piece of it somehow. Like, you know, if there is a God out there, I'm sure he can see in all directions and must know what's going on. So let's make this statue with faces all around it. And, you know, I think God's like, you know, you're not sure that's me. And so you're getting some part of it wrong, because you need to know that that's me. But yeah, I can do that. And that is a part of who I am. So, you know, all of these things I think can be things that can be stepping stones to help people say, like, well, it's like in Acts 17, right? You know, Paul goes to Mars Hill and he's looking at all these different statues and he sees there's one to an unknown God. And he's like, hey, you guys are so religious, you realize you might have missed something somewhere. Let me introduce you to what you missed, right? He uses that as a bridge from where they are and what they do know about God, even if it's just a little slice of it, to show them a little bit something more. And I look at passages like this and I think, okay, maybe, you know, how would if the Babylonians had come over and heard Ezekiel kind of rattling off his vision, they would have heard some of this stuff and they would, whoa, wow, like, well, that must be a really powerful God up there if these are the things that are carrying them around. And that's definitely part of the message he's trying to get across to Ezekiel. So.
It's interesting you referenced Romans 1 to 21 and 23. For although they knew God, as God gave them the knowledge, they neither glorified him as God nor gave thanks to him, but their thinking became futile, and their foolish hearts were darkened. And although they claimed to be wise, they became fools and exchanged the glory of the immortal God for images made to look like mortal man and birds and animals and
Mm-hmm.
nothing good.
Yeah, yeah, and you know, and it's there's so many. Well, I think about like that story in it's in 1 Samuel. I think it's 1 Samuel, when Saul or somebody is like, he just gets ahead of him. He's like, well, let's take the Ark of the Covenant out with it. Now I'm sure we'll win the battle. And God's like, I'm not with you. So they lose the Ark. So they take it to the temple of Dagon or something. I can't remember. I think that's the god. And then they leave for the night. They come back and like the statue of Dagon's knocked over. So they're like, oh, well, let's put it back up. Then the next day it comes over and like its hands are broken off. And then eventually they're like, let's put this thing back, you know. And then, yeah, and there is, you know, God's got a sense of humor about some of these things, I think. Yeah, but it's that idea that there is a longing to connect with the divine in all of us, because that's how God made us for him. And if you don't have the revelation of God as found in the Bible, in the person of Jesus Christ and the ongoing work of the Holy Spirit, like, where do you direct that? Like, maybe you direct it at something that's 30 degrees off from where it should go, and they end up exchanging the truth of God because they just don't know any better, or because this fits better with their worldview, or because this is what they've known, or because this is what works for them functionally. So yeah, and I do think it's an interesting thing that gets brought up in the very first chapter of Ezekiel, because one of the arguments that God makes to the people of Israel is that you are in exile because you have failed in your mission to be a light for the other nations. So even in the way that God announces that he's with them, he does it in a way that could actually communicate the truth about the one living God to the nations. So anyway, I got that out of a footnote in my Bible, just so you know. Yeah. It's almost 8, so we're almost out of time. I didn't know if you had other thoughts or questions about this. The other thing I was going to ask you is we have another deep dive next week on the book of Ezekiel. And at this point, I have planned 0 of it because I thought, well, having done kind of laid the groundwork tonight, are there certain things that you would want to talk about? Are there questions that come to mind for you? Like, I would love to go more into this or that. I mean, I may not know the answers to any of the questions, but I'm certainly willing to try to look into them if you've got specific things that you want to talk about.
We may think on it.
What you can think on it, and you can email me because I'm not going to work on it until Monday anyway. And Mary Jo, as long as you come back next week with your Bible with the notes, we can make sure that one of us has the answers. Yeah, great. And I don't know, and we're I know that the way we have it set up for this series, Cass is kind of doing the reading plan where you just read a chapter of Ezekiel every day. There's a question or two. Would encourage you to keep doing that. I do need to warn. I mean, there's some stuff in Ezekiel that's weird, and there's some stuff in Ezekiel that's hard to understand. And there's a couple of chapters in Ezekiel that kind of read like softcore pornography. I mean, really, just some of the sexual language and imagery is so explicit. And you really, and again, but you really, I remember reading that part when I was reading through it that summer, thinking, wait a minute, like, did somebody give me a fake Bible and they like put some stuff in here to see if I was really reading this? Like, really, is that what's going on? But again, you go back when you get to passages like that, and you just think, what is going on? Like, you can go back to, where was it? Some of those themes, the themes of the books of Ezekiel, right? And one of which is Israel has completely abandoned Yahweh. So it's almost like Ezekiel is the same guy who laid on his side for a year with rope tied around him and shaved off his hair and burned it. Like, he knew how to make a point dramatically. So when he's trying to talk about how you have completely abandoned Yahweh, like, using this really sexually explicit imagery is a way to describe this is what you have done to the God who was your husband, And so, I mean, you read it and you're like, whoa. But I think that's how understanding these themes can help you make sense of things like that. Anything else? Good. So I've got one.
We need to bring these next week.
Well, next week you guys are in charge of it, of the deep dive. I'm just going to bring all of my questions that I haven't figured out yet, and I gave you guys some handouts, so I expect you to have all the answers by then.
So did this Tim Mackey do the whole class that you went through?
Yeah, he's a professor at Western Seminary. So he did like a 2.5 days of basically like 8 to 5 for 2 days and 8 to noon on Wednesday, I think. So yeah, it was. So the only thing better than Ezekiel is 20 hours of Ezekiel in a row, and then you're just kind of like, whoa, whoa, whoa. I have one last handout for you if you want it. It's just like a little kind of overview. There's a really helpful book called How to Read the Bible Book by Book by Gordon Fee and Douglas Stewart. Fee is a New Testament scholar and Stewart is an Old Testament scholar. And they just have this, there's like a little 6-page introduction to each book in the Bible, and they say, yes. And it's like, here's the content, here's who wrote it, here's the emphases. So I just pulled that straight there from there. And then I put on the bottom there, if you're interested in buying a commentary or looking at a commentary on the book of Ezekiel, you may have commentaries that you like. There are lots of good ones out there. Here are just 3 that I'd recommend. So one of them it's actually this book, The Message of Ezekiel. It's only like 400 pages long. But it's written in a fairly accessible style. If you really want something academic, Daniel Block's commentary is 1,800 pages. It's one of those books that they have to publish in 2 volumes because you just can't make a book that thick. Yes. So it's if you want to go in depth, you can do that. And then that NIV application commentary, the last one, I really like that series of commentaries because it tries to sort of bridge the gap between here's the historical context, here's how you kind of bring that to today, and here's how it might apply. And it just depends on who the author of the individual volume is, but that approach is one that I find to be really helpful. So that's what I've got. Hopefully you guys will email me or get in touch with me and let me know some more questions or things that you want to talk about next week. Otherwise, it may be a really short deep dive. It'll be a shallow dive because we won't have anything to talk about. Now I'm sure I can figure out some stuff about Ezekiel that's weird and interesting to talk about.
Well, we keep doing that, we go.
Yeah, there, that's right. That's right. Just keep trucking ahead. So that's what I got.
Thank you, Mike.
You're welcome. I got all these text messages. I'm wondering if I have to pick a kid up at volleyball or soccer or something like that. So